He didn't even get out of the wagon. That was the part Clara Whitmore could not stop thinking about, even hours later, standing alone on the sun-cracked platform of Dunmore Station, with her small trunk at her feet and the Arizona heat pressing down on her like something alive. Silas Mercer had driven up in his wagon, looked at her, really looked at her, eyes moving from her face down to her left leg, to the slight drag in her step as she came down from the train, and something in his expression had closed. Not gradually, all at once, like a door being shut and latched from the inside. He did not come down to greet her. He did not tip his hat. He did not say her name. He just picked up the reins, clicked his tongue at the horse, and drove away. No explanation, no apology, no backward glance. Clara stood there until the sound of the wagon wheels faded into the distance. And then she stood there a little longer, because her legs had stopped working properly, and it had nothing to do with the limp. She had not been born with the limp. That was the thing people never thought to ask about. They saw it, and assumed it had always been there, that she had come into the world already marked, already lesser. The truth was simpler and harder than that. She had been 12 years old when a horse spooked on a wet road outside her family's farm in Missouri, and the cart had gone over, and her left leg had been pinned beneath the wheel for long enough that the bone broke in 3 places. The doctor who said it had done a fair enough job, but fair enough was not the same as right, and by the time Clara was 13, it was clear that she would always walk the way she walked, with that slight pull at the left hip, that small hitch in her stride that people noticed immediately and then pretended not to. She had spent a decade becoming someone who did not let it matter. She had taught herself to work a garden, to manage a household, to sow and preserve and tend animals, to do every practical thing that life on a working farm required. She had become, by necessity, more capable than most women her age, because she understood from an early age that she would not be chosen for her face or her walk. She would have to be chosen for something else. She was 31 years old. Her mother had died the previous spring. Her brother had taken over the family farm and made it politely, but clearly obvious that there was not room for a spinster sister in his new wife's household. And then she had found the advertisement in the back pages of a St. Louis paper, the kind that ran in columns alongside notices for lost livestock and wanted farmhands, seeking a hard-working woman for frontier ranch. Appearance secondary. Willingness to work is what matters. Silas Mercer, Dunmore, Arizona Territory. She had written him 3 letters before he responded. When he did, he was not romantic. He was practical. He told her the ranch needed managing. He told her he needed a partner who was not afraid of hard work. He told her, specifically, that beauty was not a requirement. She had read that line 4 times. She had written back and told him about her leg. He had written back and said it did not matter to him. She had believed him. That was the mistake she would spend a long time trying to forgive herself for. The station agent, a small bird-like man named Harwick, who smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, had watched the whole thing from behind his window. He did not come out immediately. Clara suspected he was giving her time to collect herself, which she appreciated, even if she resented needing it. When he finally emerged, he stopped a respectful distance away and looked at her trunk rather than at her face. "Got somewhere to be, miss?" "I thought I did," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that. She had always been better at appearing calm than at feeling it. Harwick scratched the back of his neck. "That was Mercer's wagon." "Yes." "He didn't." "No," she said. "He didn't." A silent stretch between them, the kind that had a shape to it. Harwick looked out toward the road where the wagon had gone, and his expression said something he was too polite to put into words. Clara had lived long enough to read that kind of expression. It said, "I'm not surprised, but I'm sorry." "There a boarding house in town?" she asked. "Mrs. Aldrin runs one. Half a mile up the main road." He paused. "She's particular. You'd need to pay a week in advance." Clara did the arithmetic in her head quickly and did not let the calculation show on her face. She had enough for 2 weeks, maybe 3, if she was careful. She had brought what she could carry, and she had spent the rest of her savings on the train ticket because she had believed, truly believed, that she was traveling towards something permanent. Picked up her trunk. It was heavier than it looked, and the angle of the platform made carrying it harder on her left side, and she was aware of Harwick watching her, and aware of herself being aware of him, and all of that made the distance to the road feel longer than it was. She did not ask for help. She did not look back. Mrs. Aldrin's boarding house was a faded yellow building with a porch that sagged slightly on one end, and curtains that had once been white. The woman herself was broad and suspicious, with the manner of someone who had extended kindness to strangers before and regretted it, and she looked at Clara the way people sometimes looked at stray animals, trying to calculate the trouble they would bring. "You're not from here," she said. "Missouri," Clara said. "What brings you to Dunmore?" Clara considered the most accurate answer. "A misunderstanding," she said. Mrs. Aldrin rented her the smallest room, the one at the back of the house that caught no morning light and smelled faintly of mildew. Clara paid for 6 nights, counted the remaining bills twice after the woman left, and then sat on the edge of the narrow bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of something she refused to call crying. It wasn't crying, she told herself. It was the body releasing pressure, the way a steam valve releases when the boiler gets too full. It was practical. It was necessary. It did not mean she was broken. After 5 minutes, she wiped her face with the hem of her sleeve and took stock. She had 6 nights of shelter. She had money for perhaps 10 more days of food if she was careful. She had no prospects, no connections, no family to wire, and no intention of going back to Missouri to become a burden in her brother's house, while his new wife found increasingly polite ways to make her feel unwelcome. She has also in her life survived worse than a man driving away from a train platform. She just needed to think. Thinking led her, on the second day, to a conversation at the dry goods store. The kind of conversation that happens sideways, when you're pretending to examine bolts of fabric while really listening to 2 women talk 2 rows over. They were discussing a ranch south of town. A man named Caleb Rourke, who had been in some kind of accident. The details were vague, but the conclusion was not. He'd been alone out there for days. Someone had ridden past and heard what they thought was a man calling out, but no one had gone to check because Rourke had a reputation for being difficult. "Probably just drunk," one of the women said. "Maybe," the other said. "Or maybe he's lying out there in the heat, and we'll find out about it at the end of the week when nobody's seen him." So they moved on. Clara stayed where she was for a moment, her hand resting on a bolt of blue cotton, and thought about what she'd just heard. Told herself it was not her concern. She had her own situation to manage. She was already stretched thin, already in a town where she knew no one, already 1 week from being completely without resources. Taking on someone else's trouble would be foolish. She bought a small tin of coffee, a length of clean cotton cloth, and a jar of carbolic salve that cost more than she would have liked. She asked the shopkeeper for directions to the Rourke ranch. She found him in the barn, not at first. At first she found the smell which hit her before she even pushed the barn door open, the sharp rot sweetness of infected flesh mixed with old hay and animal warmth. She had smelled it before, once, when a farmhand on her family's property had let a cut go too long in the summer heat. She had been 17. She remembered thinking she had never smelled anything so wrong. No, this was worse. Caleb Rourke was on the ground near the back stall, half propped against the wall, with one arm stretched out as if he'd been reaching for something when he finally stopped being able to reach. He was a large man. She could tell that even with him folded the way he was, with dark hair matted against his forehead and a wound on his left side that someone had attempted to bandage and failed. The bandage was black with old blood and something else Clara preferred not to name. He was breathing, barely. His eyes opened when she crouched beside him, not fully, just enough to register that something was different, that he was no longer alone. He started. "Don't," she said. "Save it." He looked at her for a moment with eyes that couldn't quite focus. Then they closed again. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the wound, and the bandage, and the man, and the barn, and she calculated everything she had brought, and everything she had not brought, and how far town was, and how long he had probably already been lying here. Then she got to work. The next 4 hours were not heroic. They were ugly and exhausting, and twice she had to stop and press her forehead against the barn wall and breathe through her mouth because the smell was making her eyes water. The wound was deeper than she had hoped. Something had gouged him badly on the left side, below the ribs, and infection had taken hold with the efficiency that infection always had in desert heat. She cleaned it as thoroughly as she could with the carbolic salve and the clean cotton, which was not thoroughly enough, but was better than nothing. She got water from the well outside 3 trips because she could only carry the bucket so far before her. Left leg started to protest, and she kept him drinking when he surfaced long enough to swallow. He surfaced twice. The first time he tried to tell her his name as if that were the important thing. "I know your name," she said. Caleb Rourke rested. The second time, he grabbed her wrist. His grip was weaker than he probably intended it to be, but there was something in it that wasn't weakness, something that was trying to be communication. "You don't have to, I know," she said. She kept working. By the time the light started going gold and long through the barn door, she had done everything she could do with what she had. She built a small fire near the barn entrance to keep the night from getting too cold, dragged a horse blanket over from the tack room, and made herself as comfortable as was possible on a barn floor with a dying stranger breathing 6 feet away. She did not sleep much. She checked on him through the night 4 times, 5 pressing the back of her hand to his forehead to track the fever, listening to his breathing for any change that meant she had miscalculated. She had made a lot of miscalculations in the past week. She did not intend to make another one. By the 3rd morning, the fever had not broken, but it had not worsened. By the 4th, she could see the infection beginning to pull back from the edges of the wound still. Bad, still dangerous, but no longer advancing. On the 4th afternoon, Caleb Rourke opened his eyes and looked at her with something close to genuine focus for the first time. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough and thin with disuse, and there was something in it that Clara could not quite read. Not accusation exactly, but close to it, as if her continued presence was a thing he needed to account for and couldn't. "Yes," she said. Why, it was a fair question. She had been asking it herself for 4 days, turning it over between other tasks, between carrying water and cleaning the wound and trying to get some order into the small kitchen she'd found attached to the back of the house, which had been left in a state that suggested Caleb Rourke had not cooked an actual meal in some time. She had several answers. Some of them were honest. "Because you needed someone to," she said. "And I was here." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw tightened slightly, the way a person's jaw tightened when they were deciding whether to argue with something. He didn't argue. "Caleb Rourke," he said, as if they hadn't been in the same barn for 4 days. "Clara Whitmore," she said, another silence. Outside, one of the horses in the paddock made a sound and stamped, and somewhere farther off a hawk was calling. "The Mercer woman," he said. Clara went very still. "News travels fast in small towns," he said. His voice was still rough, but there was something careful in it now. Not cruel. Careful. Harwick mentioned Semyon waiting at the station. "I wasn't waiting long," she said. It was not entirely true. She had been waiting for months, for the letters to become real, for the distance to close, for the promise of a life that someone else had made, and then revoked before she even stepped off the train. She had been waiting longer than 4 days on a platform, but she was finished with that particular kind of waiting. "No," Caleb said quietly, looking at the ceiling. "I don't suppose you were." On the 5th day, he was sitting up. On the 6th, he made it to the doorway of the barn and stood there in the early morning, looking at his own land, with the expression of a man who had not expected to see it again. Clara watched him from where she was. She had started on the kitchen garden, which had gone completely to dry weeds and cracked earth, and she noticed the way his shoulders changed when he stood in the open air. Something in them lowered, something released. You don't have to do that, he said, nodding toward the garden. I know, she said. It was becoming, she realized, their shorthand. The two words that meant something more than their surface. She knew she didn't have to. She was choosing to. That was the difference between being pushed into a life and walking into one with your own feet, even when one of those feet dragged a little. She worked the soil with the small hand fork she'd found in the barn, breaking up the hard crust of it, feeling the grit pack under her fingernails. And she tried not to think about Silas Mercer, looking at her from his wagon and deciding in the space of 2 seconds that whatever he had imagined was not what she was. She tried not to think about it. She mostly failed. But the garden was real, and the dirt was real, and the man standing in the barn doorway watching her, with something in his expression she had not yet learned to read. That was real too. And real, she had decided, was where she intended to stay. On the 7th day, he tried to lift a fence post and nearly went down. Clara was at the water trough when it happened. She heard the grunt of effort, then a sharp hiss of breath that had pain in it, and she turned to see Caleb, with one hand braced on the paddock rail and the other pressed flat against his left side. Fence post, lying in the dirt where he'd dropped it. His jaw was set, and his eyes were closed, and he had the expression of a man who was furious at his own body for betraying him in front of a witness. She did not run to him. She had learned in 7 days that running to him made things worse. She walked over, set down the bucket, and looked at the post in the dirt, and then at him. You're not ready for that, she said. I'm fine. You're not. His eyes opened. They were dark brown. She had noticed, not the warm brown that people described as kind, but the darker kind, the kind that had held things back. Right now, they were holding back a considerable amount of pain and a somewhat smaller amount of pride. I've got a ranch to run, he said. You've got a ranch to survive first, she said. The fence can wait 2 more days. You can't afford to tear that wound open again. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't entirely read, and then he looked away, out across the land, and said nothing. She had come to understand that his silences were not empty. They were full of things he was choosing not to say, and it was usually the choosing that took the longest. She picked up the bucket and went back to her work. Evening, he ate a full bowl of the beans she'd made, not the thin broth she'd been feeding him for a week. Actual beans, with a piece of salt pork she'd found in the back of the larder, cooked down until they were something close to a meal. He ate without commenting on it, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a compliment. Where did you learn to tend a wound like that? He asked, when the bowl was empty. Farmhand on our property, when I was 17, she said. He let a cut go septic in July. I was the only one home. Did he make it? He did, she said. Walked with a limp for the rest of his life, though. The words came out before she thought about them, and she felt the small, awkward weight of them settle in the room. Caleb looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them addressed it directly. Well, he said finally, I suppose limping is better than the alternative. It is, she said. I'd recommend it. Something shifted in his expression then, not quite a smile, but the territory just before one, the small easing that happened when a person decided, just for a moment, to stop bracing themselves. It was the first time she had seen it. She filed it away without making anything of it. The days took on a shape that surprised her with its steadiness. She woke before him. She always had, even on the farm in Missouri, some internal alarm that pulled her upright in the gray pre-dawn, regardless of how little she'd slept. She started the fire, put the coffee on, did a first check of the animals before the heat came up. The ranch had 3 horses, a small herd of cattle that had been left too long without proper management, a handful of chickens that had gone half wild and resented being corralled, and a mule named Fletcher, who had a personality that Clara found both aggravating and deeply relatable. Fletcher did not want to be told what to do. Fletcher would cooperate eventually, but only after making clear that the cooperation was voluntary and could be withdrawn at any time. Clara respected this, even when it made her mornings harder. Caleb would emerge from the house around the time the coffee was ready, moving more easily each day, but still with a careful quality to his movements, still favoring his left side in ways he thought she didn't notice. He would take the coffee without a word, drink half of it standing in the doorway, looking at the land, and then join her in whatever needed doing. They worked mostly, in a companionable quiet that Clara had not expected. She had anticipated awkwardness. Two strangers thrown together by accident and necessity, tripping over each other's presence. But the awkwardness was there, and then it wasn't, replaced by something more practical. He knew the land and the animals. He knew management and order, and the particular efficiency that came from having spent a lifetime learning to do things without wasting motion. Together, they covered more ground than either of them would have alone. She started on the kitchen garden properly on the 8th day. The soil was poor, hard-packed, and mineral-thin from neglect, and it needed work before anything would take in it. She spent a full morning breaking it up, mixing in the composted matter she'd found at the back of the barn, working in the steady, methodical way that she'd learned, produced results where enthusiasm alone would not. Caleb came and stood at the edge of it around midday, watching. "There was a garden here," he said, 2 years ago. "I know. I can see where the rows were." He was quiet for a moment. "Planted it," he said. "My wife, Clara, kept working." She did not look up. She understood, instinctively, that this was not an invitation for questions. It was a door opened a crack, just enough to let a little light in, and she should not push against it. "What grew best?" she asked. He thought about it. "Tomatoes," he said. "And the squash," she said. The squash was too easy to bother being proud of. She was right about that, Clara said. "Squash will grow if you look at it sideways. Tomatoes take some convincing." He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "I'll get you some seed stock from Harwick's when I'm back on my feet." "Thank you," she said. He stood there another minute, looking at the turned earth, and then he went back to the paddock where he had been slowly, carefully, working on the fence post, not lifting it, she noticed, just organizing the tools around it, managing things within his current limits without being asked. She watched him go and thought about a woman she had never met who had planted tomatoes in this since 2 years ago and felt the particular ache of that, not jealousy, nothing as simple or selfish as that, but something more like grief for a stranger, for a loss she had no right to, but could see the shape of clearly in the way this man moved through his own life. She made her first trip into town on the 9th day. She needed salt, more carbolic, a few things for the kitchen that the larder didn't have. She borrowed one of the horses, a bay mare named Dust, who was easier to manage than her name suggested, and rode the 4 miles into Dunmore on a morning that was already hot and getting hotter. Sky that particular flat white blue of the Arizona desert in summer. She did what she needed to do quickly. She had become good at quick. She paid Harwick for the salt and the other supplies, accepted his careful nod without requiring conversation, and was nearly out the door when she heard her name from across the street. Not her real name. The other one. The one she had not chosen. That's as the Mercer woman. The voice was female, not young, not attempting to be quiet. The one he left at the station. "I heard she went out to the Rourke place. Apparently she's been staying there." A pause, loaded with implication. With him, the voice continued. "Alone." Clara kept walking. Her left leg hit the step down from the boardwalk at a slightly wrong angle, and she caught herself on the rail, and she heard the small sound that one of the women across the street made. Not cruelty exactly, more the involuntary noise of someone seeing a thing they had already expected to see. She got on the horse and rode. She held herself straight in the saddle all the way back to the ranch, and she did not let herself feel it until she was in the barn with Dust, unsaddling the mare with the particular focus of someone who needed their hands to be doing something specific and real. The conversation she had overheard was not the worst thing anyone had said about her. It was not even close to the worst. But there was something about being in a new place, a place you had traveled more than 1,000 miles toward with hope still intact. There was something about being reduced, in that place, to a rumor. She was almost done with the saddle when she heard him come in. Caleb moved better than he had a week ago, though she could still hear the slight unevenness in his footsteps when he was tired. He stopped when he saw her face. She knew what he was seeing. She was not a person who hid things well when her hands were occupied with something else. Her face did what it wanted when she was focused elsewhere. "What happened in town?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I got what we needed, Clara." She stopped. He had used her name perhaps 4 times since she'd told it to him, and each time it had landed with a weight that surprised her. Not because it meant anything particular, just because it was her actual name. Not the Mercer woman, not the woman Silas left, not the one who walked wrong. She set the saddle on the rack and told him what she'd heard. Kept it brief. She was not looking for sympathy. She had learned young that reaching for sympathy was like reaching for water in sand. Mostly, you just got your hands dirty. She told him as a matter of fact, the way you'd report a problem with the fence line or a sick animal in the pasture. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. His jaw was doing the thing again. That held tight set that meant he was managing something internal. But this time, there was a different quality to it. "Who?" he said. "It doesn't matter. It does to me." "Caleb," she said. "I've been hearing things like that my entire adult life. I'm not looking for you to go into town and have words with someone on my behalf." "I wasn't planning to have words," he said, and the flatness of his voice made it unclear whether he was joking. "Even better," she said. "Don't." He looked at her steadily. She looked back at him steadily. It was, she had discovered, a thing they did. These quiet standoffs where neither of them was trying to win, exactly, just trying to be understood without having to say everything out loud. "People are going to talk," she said. "They always do. I'd rather give them less to talk about by doing good work and minding my own business than by making a scene." "That's very sensible," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. I still don't like it." "You don't have to," she said. "It's not your business to like or dislike." They were talking about me. Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Not offense, something more complicated. He looked down at the ground, then back up at her. "Fair enough," he said. She nodded and walked past him toward the house to put away the supplies, and she was aware of him standing in the barn doorway watching her go, and she was aware that the awareness itself was a complication she had not asked for and was not sure what to do. The cattle were a bigger problem than she had initially assessed. She had grown up with horses and pigs and chickens, but not cattle at any scale, and the small herd Caleb ran 40, maybe 45 head, had been left too long without consistent management. 2 of them were showing signs of illness she couldn't identify. The back pasture fence had gaps that were being ignored because Caleb had not been in a condition to address them. 3 calves had wandered too far from the main herd and were looking underfed. Came to him with this on a Thursday, 10 days into her time at the ranch, with a straightforward accounting of what she'd found and what she thought needed doing, and in what order. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Some men had a habit of interrupting a woman mid-report to tell her the part she'd already gotten to. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his coffee cooling in front of him and let her finish. "You've been out to the back pasture?" he said. "This morning? That's a mile from the house." "I'm aware of how far it is," she said without inflection. He let that sit. "The sick ones. Can you describe what you saw?" Described it. He asked 3 specific questions. She answered them. He thought for a moment and then told her what he suspected it was. A common enough ailment in this heat, treatable if caught early, and what to do about it. "I can show you," he said, "if you'd rather see than be told." "Show me," she said. That afternoon, they walked the back pasture together, and for the first time she saw him in his actual element, not recovering, not managing pain, but doing what he knew how to do in ground he understood. He moved differently out here, more certain. He touched the cattle with a practiced ease, reading them with his hands the way she read soil, and he explained what he was doing as he went, without making her feel like a student, just as someone working alongside who deserved to understand the reasoning. It occurred to her, walking behind him through the dry grass, with the heat pressing down and the cattle shifting around them, that she had not felt this useful, specifically useful, part of something working in a very long time. That thought arrived and sat in her chest in a way she didn't entirely trust. The second trip to town did not go better. She needed it for practical reasons. There were things the ranch required that couldn't wait, and she went on a Saturday, because Saturday was when supplies were most likely to be stocked. Saturdays it was also when the town was most full of people, which she had not thought through as carefully as she should have. She was at the dry goods counter when she heard the footsteps behind her, a deliberate kind, the kind that announced intention. Miss Whitmore. She turned. The man was younger than she'd expected, not much older than 30, with a clean-shaved face and the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. She did not know him, but she knew the type. She had known that type her whole life, in different faces, different towns. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "We haven't," he said. "I'm Tom Aldridge. I run the feed operation north of town." He paused in a way that was designed to be significant. "I heard you've been staying out at the Rourke place." "I have," she said. "Alone with him." "He was injured," she said. "He needed care. I provided it." She turned back to the counter. "Miss Whitmore," he said again, and there was something in his voice now that was not friendliness. It had never really been friendliness. She understood just the social costume of it. A woman in your position ought to be careful. Rourke is a difficult man. People will talk. People, she said, not turning around, already are. I've been in Dunmore less than 2 weeks. That's what I mean, he said, as if she'd agreed with him. A woman traveling alone, nowhere to go, staying out at a bachelor rancher's property. It doesn't look right. She turned back around then. She looked at him, the way she looked at problems that needed solving straight on, without flinching, taking inventory. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "I am 31 years old. I traveled to this territory alone. I found a man near death and I kept him alive. I am currently helping run a working ranch." "What exactly? About that doesn't look right to you." He blinked. He had expected something different, some version of apology or embarrassment, or that particular lowering of the eyes that women sometimes performed when men like him said things like that. "You're not only anything," she said. "You're telling a woman she should be ashamed of useful work, and I don't have any interest in being told that." She paid for her supplies and walked out. Her hands were shaking slightly as she tied the saddlebag to dust. She was angry in the hot, specific way that came from having the same conversation too many times, from being constantly measured against a standard that had nothing to do with what she was actually capable of. She breathed through it. She was practiced at breathing through it. What she was less practiced at was the voice that came from the doorway of the dry goods store behind her. Clara, she turned. Caleb was standing there. She stared at him. "What are you doing in town?" "You're not ready." "I rode slowly," he said. He was pale, and he was holding himself carefully against the doorframe, but his eyes were clear, and they were angry in the same direction hers were. "I heard what he said to you." "You were in there?" "I came in to get something, and heard most of it." He looked across the street to where Tom Aldridge had retreated. "You handled it. I don't need you to come into town and mine inside." "I know," he said. "I'm not here to fight your battles. I'm here because I needed salt, and because I can make my own decisions about when I'm well enough to ride." She looked at him. He looked back at her. His jaw was tight, and his color was not good, and he had ridden 4 miles on a wound that was 2 weeks old. Because she did not let herself finish that thought completely. "Get on your horse," she said, "before you fall off the doorframe." "I'm not going to fall off the doorframe." "You're gripping it," she said. He looked down at his hand. He was, in fact, gripping it. He released it with a dignity that she found, despite everything, somewhat impressive. They rode back together, not talking much. The silence between them had changed in character since those first days. It was less full of things unsaid and more full of things understood. The land spread out around them in the flat, bright way of the Arizona afternoon. and the horses moved at an easy pace because they were both making allowances, for different reasons, so some and neither of them mentioned it. She found the ledger book on a Tuesday. She had been trying to get the house in order, not as any statement of intent, just because disorder made her anxious, and the house had been, before she arrived, in a state that suggested a man managing grief by not managing much of anything. She found the ledger in the bottom drawer of the desk, in the small room off the kitchen that Caleb used when he used it at all, buried under a layer of receipts and old correspondence. She should have left it. It was not her ledger. She opened it anyway. She wished she hadn't. The numbers were not catastrophic, not yet. They were bad. The ranch had been losing ground for 18 months, steadily and quietly, in the way that things often declined when the person responsible for them was operating on the far edge of themselves. Supplies bought on credit. A note at the bank that was coming due. She counted the months and felt something cold in her stomach in less than 8 weeks. Repair bill for the equipment barn that had not been paid. Through it all, the cattle numbers slowly shrinking, not from disease, but from sales made too cheaply, too quickly, in what she recognized as the financial behavior of someone running from a tally rather than toward a plan. She sat with the ledger open in her lap for a long time. He had been drowning. Before the injury, before the infection, before she arrived in this barn, he had already been drowning, and the injury had been only the most visible part of a disaster that had been building quietly for a year and a half. She heard him come in from outside. She did not put the ledger away. When he appeared in the doorway of the small office and saw what she was holding, he went completely still. Color that had been slowly returning to his face over the past 2 weeks drained again. Not from pain this time. That's not, he started. I know, she said. I shouldn't have looked at it. I'm sorry for that. He stared at the ledger in her hands. Something passed across his face that she had not seen there before. A rawness, an unguarded exposure. It was worse than anger. Anger she could have managed. How bad? He asked. You know how bad, she said. You've been looking at those numbers. I want to know what you think. Think, she said carefully, that you have about 8 weeks before the banknote comes due. And I think the cattle situation needs to be turned around before that, or the note can't be met. He leaned against the doorframe. He looked suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with his injury. I know, he said. There are things that can be done, she said. The herd can be turned around. The back pasture can support more head than it's carrying. There are some decisions about which stock to sell and which to keep that I think you've been making the wrong way. Not wrong, just reactive instead of planned. He was looking at her now, with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her before. Attention. Real attention. The kind that meant he was actually hearing her rather than waiting for her to finish. You know cattle, he said. I know ledgers, she said. And I know what the numbers are saying. He was quiet. Outside, Fletcher the mule made his characteristic sound of general dissatisfaction. What are you suggesting? Caleb asked. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about the train ticket she had bought with her savings, the room at Mrs. Aldrin's boarding house, the 6 nights she had paid for and abandoned. She thought about the woman in the general store, and Tom Aldridge in the doorway, and Silas Mercer's wagon disappearing down the road without a backward glance. She thought about the garden she had planted, and the cattle she was beginning to learn, and the ledger in her lap, with its 8 weeks of its solvable runway and its solvable problems, them, instead of run from them. I'm suggesting, she said, that we make a plan, a real one, together, if you're willing. He looked at her for a long time. The light was going outside, turning the room that particular dim amber of the Arizona late afternoon, and in it he looked less like a man who had nearly died, and more like a man deciding something. I don't take charity, he said. That's not what this is, she said. Then what is it? She held up the ledger. This is a problem with a solution. I'm good at those. She set it on the desk, and you're going to need someone who is pushed off the doorframe. He crossed the room and pulled the other chair out from behind the desk, the one on the far side, the one that had clearly not been moved in months. and sat down across from her. "Show me," he said. And she did. They sat at that desk for 3 hours. She went through the ledger page by page, and he filled in the gaps she couldn't see in the numbers alone. Which cattle were worth keeping, which could be sold at better prices than he'd been getting, who owed him money he had let slide because he didn't have the energy to pursue it, what the equipment actually needed versus what could wait. She organized it as he talked, making notes in the margins in her careful small handwriting, building a shape out of what had been a formless weight. It was not comfortable. There were moments when he went quiet in ways that were not about thinking, but about the particular shame of having someone see a thing you'd been hiding from yourself. She did not comment on those moments. She just waited them out and then moved to the next item. By the time the lamp was necessary, they had something that resembled a plan. Not a perfect plan. She was under no illusions about that. 8 weeks was not a lot of runway, and the work required was real and difficult, and things could still go wrong in any number of ways. But it was a plan. Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at the pages she had laid out and was quiet for a while. The lamp threw shadows across his face, and Clara sat across from him and waited. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. She thought about the question seriously. It was a serious question. She had earned the right to answer it honestly. "Because the alternative," she said, "is going back to Missouri and pretending I have something to go back to." "Practical reason," he said. "What's the other one?" She looked at him. He looked back. "Because I'm good at this," she said, "and I haven't had anywhere to be good at it in a long time." He nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone who understood that particular kind of hunger, not for approval, but for purpose. For a place where what you were actually capable of was allowed to matter. He looked at the plan she'd laid out, and then he looked at her, and he said something that surprised her. "Stay," he said. "Not just until I'm better. Actually stay. We'll work this out together." Clara looked at the lamp and the ledger, and the plan they'd built in 3 hours, and she thought about the empty platform and the wagon driving away and the room at Mrs. Aldrin's that smelled of mildew, and she thought about the turned earth of the kitchen garden, and the cattle and the back pasture, and Fletcher the mule and his magnificent stubbornness. "We'd need to agree on terms," she said. "Clear ones." "Name them," he said. She named them. He didn't argue with a single one. Outside, the desert settled into its night sounds, and the lamp burned steady, and the plan sat between them on the desk, imperfect and possible, which was more than either of them had walked into this place expecting. The plan worked in the way that real plans work, not cleanly, not on schedule, with 2 steps forward and 1 step sideways, and at least 1 moment per week where something went wrong that neither of them had accounted for. The first cattle sale happened 3 weeks after the night they sat at the desk with the ledger. Caleb rode out to a rancher named Duval, who ran a larger operation 15 miles east, and Clara stayed back because they had agreed she would, because Duval was the kind of man who would negotiate worse if a woman was present, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Caleb came back with a price that was better than what he'd been getting, but not as good as what the cattle were worth. And he told her this without softening it, and she wrote the number in the ledger without comment. "Better than last time?" she asked. "By 30%. "Then it's a start," she said. He was still favoring his left side when he dismounted, and she noticed but did not say anything, because they had developed, over the weeks, a mutual policy of not commenting on each other's limitations, unless the limitation was actively dangerous. It was one of the terms she had named that first night at the desk, though she had not phrased it quite so precisely. What she had said was, "I don't want to be managed, and I won't manage you." He had looked at her for a moment, and then said, "Fair," and that had been that. Cattle sale bought them time. Not enough time, never quite enough, but enough to breathe, enough to work the next part of the plan, which was the back pasture fence. Needed to be done before they could bring more head in from the eastern section of the land where the grass was better. She worked the fence with him. She had not done fence work before, not at this scale, and she was slower than he was, and she knew it, and he did not make her feel it, which she appreciated more than she would have admitted. There were moments where the post hole digger caught wrong on her left side, and she had to adjust her grip, adjust her stance, find the position that let her use her upper body rather than her hip for leverage. And she did this without comment, and he did not offer assistance she hadn't asked for. And between them, they got the fence done in 4 days. Instead of the 2, it might have taken him alone before his injury. She did not count it as a loss that it took 4 days, counted it as a fence that was done. The town did not leave them alone. She had hoped, not deeply, not with any real confidence, but she had hoped that if she did her work and kept to herself and gave people nothing new to discuss, the talk would gradually find other material. Towns always had new material. Someone was always doing something worth discussing. But the talk about Clara Whitmore and Caleb Rourke had a staying power she hadn't anticipated. It had the particular persistence of a story that gave people something they needed. A woman out of place, a man of uncertain reputation, a situation that could be read as scandalous with very little effort. She heard versions of it on every trip to town. She learned to walk through the dry goods store and Harwick's and the feed supplier with a face that gave nothing away, to answer questions with the minimum number of words that still counted as an answer, to be so deliberately unremarkable in her demeanor that there was nothing new for anyone to attach a story to. It worked and it did not work. What it did not account for was Silas Mercer. She had not seen him since the platform. In a town the size of Dunmore, she understood that this required some effort on someone's part, and she had occasionally wondered whether that effort was his or hers, or simply the accident of them moving in slightly different circles. She had let herself believe, without examining the belief too closely, that the situation had a kind of equilibrium to it, that he was where he was and she was where she was, and the distance between those two places was sufficient. She found out on a Friday morning that she had been wrong about the equilibrium. She was at the well behind Harwick's store, the public one, where people sometimes stopped to water horses on longer trips. When she heard voices from the other side of the fence, male voices, 2 of them, not attempting to be quiet, heard she's taken over the Rourke place entirely. One of them said, "Can't blame Rourke," said the other. "Man nearly died. Needs someone to look after things." Silas says she was always like that, pushy, had opinions about everything. A pause, says he could see it in her letters, but he gave her the benefit of the doubt, tried to do right by her, and she wasn't what he'd been led to believe. The sound of a water bucket being pulled up, says she misrepresented herself, the voice continued. Condition. Clara had stopped breathing somewhere around, Silas says. She stood very still on her side of the fence, with the water bucket in her hand, and felt something happening in her chest that she did not want to name. Not grief, not quite grief, something colder and more specific. The particular sensation of having a thing you knew to be true contradicted by someone else's version of events in public, without your knowledge, building a case against you while you were standing 20 feet away, not knowing. She had told Silas about her leg in writing. She had told him clearly in her second letter that she walked with a limp from an old injury, and he should know this before making any decisions. She had been more honest with Silas Mercer than he deserved, because she had been trying to give the arrangement the best possible chance of working. And now he was telling people she had misrepresented herself. She set the bucket down on the ground carefully, so it wouldn't make a sound, and she pressed the heel of her hand flat against the fence post and breathed. She could go around the fence and say what she needed to say. She was not afraid of him. She had never been afraid of him, not even on the platform, not even watching the wagon go. She was many things that day, but afraid had not been one of them. But the calculation she'd made in those first terrible days in Dunmore was still the right one. Making a scene would give people a story. She had learned early that a woman who made scenes was defined by the scene. A woman who didn't make scenes was defined by what she did instead, and what she did instead had to be worth more than the scene. She picked the bucket back up. She went back to the ranch. She did not tell Caleb what she had heard. that day or the next. She told herself it was because it was not productive to relay every rumor, which was true. She told herself it was because she was handling it, which was also true. She did not tell herself the third reason, which was that she did not trust what would happen if she told him specifically who was talking and what they were saying, because Caleb Rourke, on a good day, had a restraint about him that was clearly the product of considerable effort, and this was the kind of information that could make a person's effort considerably harder to maintain. The sleeplessness started that week, not dramatically. She had always been a light sleeper, always that pre-dawn alarm pulling her up out of whatever rest she'd managed. But this was different. This was lying awake in the dark room at the back of the house that Caleb had cleared out for her, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Silas Mercer, telling people she had misrepresented herself. The words circled. She would push them away and they would come back. She would remind herself of the plan and the fence and the cattle and the ledger numbers slowly improving. And the words would recede for a while, and then she would shift in the narrow bed, and the springs would make their sound, and the dark room would press in again, and there they were. She had misrepresented herself, as if she were a horse that had been sold with hidden flaws, as if the information she had given him in good faith had been a form of deception, because the reality of her in person, walking had not matched whatever version he had allowed himself to imagine. She understood what had happened. She had understood it on the platform. He had read her letters and built a woman in his mind practical, hardworking, capable, and somewhere in the building he had quietly set aside the part about the limp, let it exist in the letters as an abstraction, a word. And then she had walked toward him, and the abstraction had been a person with an actual body moving in an actual way, and the distance between the word and the person had been too much for whatever he was. She understood it. Understanding it had not made it easier. It had in some ways made it harder, because understanding something did not obligate it to stop hurting. On the fourth sleepless night, she got up before the pre-dawn light and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table where she and Caleb had drawn up the plan, and she tried to think clearly about her situation. Practical part of her situation was manageable. Plan was working. The cattle were healthier. The garden was producing. Fence was done. In 5 weeks, the banknote would come due, and their numbers said they could make it. Probably if nothing went badly wrong between now and then. The other part, the part that lived in a town 4 miles away, being built out of conversation she wasn't present for, was not something she could manage with a ledger and a plan. She sat with her coffee and the darkness and the sound of the desert, doing its night things, and she thought about Missouri. Not with longing exactly. She had not been longing for Missouri, but with the particular clarity that came at 4 in the morning when you stopped performing for anyone, including yourself. She had left Missouri because there was nothing left for her there. Her brother's house, her brother's new wife, that particular warmth that was not quite warm enough. She had been 31 years old, and she had looked at the next 30 years of her life and seen a shape she could not accept. And she had answered an advertisement in a newspaper and allowed herself to believe that something different was possible. Something different was possible. She still believed that. She believed it more now than she had on the platform, because now she had evidence. The garden, the fence, the ledger, the cattle. She had walked into a dying situation and made it less dying, and that was real in a way that Silas Mercer's version of her was not. She heard the floorboard in the hallway. Caleb came into the kitchen doorway in the way he did at night when he couldn't sleep. She had learned his nighttime sounds the same way she'd learned all his sounds. Proximity and attention, and he looked at her at the table with her coffee in the lamplight, and he did not ask her why she was awake. He went to the stove and poured his own coffee and sat down across from her. They sat like that for a while. The lamp burned. The coffee steamed. "You've been quiet this week," he said. "I've been thinking." "About?" She looked at him across the table. In the lamp's soft light, he looked less armored than he did in daylight. Not soft, just less defended. The way people looked when the hour was late enough to make pretending seem like more effort than it was worth. Silas Mercer is telling people I misrepresented myself, she said, in my letters. My condition. Caleb's hands went still around his cup. He's telling people he tried to do right by me and I wasn't what I'd led him to believe. The stillness in him now was different from his usual stillness. It had a quality to it that she had not seen before. I told him about my leg, she said. In the second letter, clearly. I wanted him to know before a seer of us made a decision we'd regret. I know, Caleb said. She looked at him. You know, Harwick told me what he's been saying. He paused. A few days ago, she sat back. And you didn't tell me. Didn't tell me, he said. I figured you had reasons. She opened her mouth and then closed it because she could not argue with that, without acknowledging that she had also been not telling him things for exactly that reason. I was going to, she said. I know, he said again. I didn't want you to do something that would make it worse. I'm not going to do something that makes it worse, he said, and there was a flatness to it that was either reassurance or the opposite. She couldn't quite tell. Caleb, I'm going to sit here and drink my coffee, he said. That's what I'm going to do right now. She watched him drink his coffee. His jaw was doing the thing. His eyes were doing the thing. His eyes were looking at a point somewhere between the table and the wall that suggested he was having a private conversation with himself that she was not invited to. He's lying, she said. I want to be clear that I know that. I don't need you to. I'm not asking you to fix it. I know you're not asking. Then why do you look like you're about to do something? He set his cup down. Because a man is saying something false about you in a town where you have to live and work, and he's doing it because he wants to explain why he drove away from a train platform without having the decency to look you in the eye, and he stopped, pressed his lips together. It makes me angry, he said more quietly. It's all, I'm just angry. Clara looked at him. She had had people be angry on her behalf, before her mother, once or twice, in the early years, when the leg was new and people were still learning to be cruel about it. That anger had always felt protective, which was another word for the assumption that she needed protecting. Caleb's anger did not feel like that. It felt more like the anger you felt on behalf of something unfair that you happened to witness, less personal, more principled. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They sat with their coffee until the first gray came into the sky outside, and then she got up and started the morning, and he got up and did the same, and the day began the way days began, with what needed doing, not with what couldn't be changed. Talk compounded. She understood now that that it had been building since she arrived, and she had been naive to think she could outwork it or outlast it. Stories about a woman living alone with a man were not stories that exhausted themselves. Grew. They collected detail from every direction. Some of it invented, some of it real and misread, all of it arranged to support a conclusion that had been reached before the evidence. She heard it from a woman named Hargrove, who stopped her on the road one afternoon with the particular manner of someone delivering news they believe to be necessary. She heard it from the way Duval's man looked at her when he came to discuss a second cattle arrangement. She heard it in the silence at the dry goods counter when she came in on a Tuesday and two women who had been talking stopped. It was not unbearable. She had borne worse, but it accumulated. The worst of it came on a Thursday 3 weeks after the sleepless nights began. She was in town for feed, a practical errand, the kind she had done a dozen times, and so she was at the loading dock of the feed supply when she heard the footsteps she had come to recognize without wanting to. Silas Mercer. He was with another man, Simeon, she didn't know, someone who had the look of a recent arrival, not yet familiar with the local arrangements. Silas saw her and did not look away. He kept walking toward the dock, and for a moment she thought he might simply pass without speaking, and she kept her eyes on the feed bags being loaded and thought, just let it pass, just let it. Miss Whitmore, he said. She turned. He looked the same as he had on the platform. That had always been the strangest part, that a person could do what he had done and look the same afterward. He was tall, fair-haired, well-dressed in the way of a man who managed a successful operation, and he was looking at her with an expression of carefully constructed civility that she recognized immediately as the face men wore when they wanted to say something cutting in public and wanted a witness who would remember them as civil. "Silas," she said. She did not give him a title. "You're looking well," he said. "I heard you've settled in at the Rourke place." "I have. Good for you." He said it the way you'd say it to a stray that had found somewhere warm to sleep. "Caleb needs someone to keep the place going. He's not," he paused, as if searching for the right word. "He's had a hard time since his wife passed. Not always easy to manage the practical side of things." "He manages fine," she said. Of course. Silas glanced at the man beside him. A brief sociable look that included the other man in something. "I worry is all." A man in his situation, struggling with the finances, and then a woman arrives who has, well, nowhere else to be. He looked back at her, and this time the civility had a crack in it, something sharper showing through. "I hope it's working out for everyone involved." Clara looked at him. She had thought about this moment, not specifically this moment, but something like it. Some version of him, saying something like this in front of someone else. She had thought about what she would say and whether she would say anything at all, and whether the silence was more powerful than the words. She had not settled it. She still hadn't settled it. What came out was not what she had planned, because she had not planned it at all. It was just the truth, delivered at the level of a normal conversation, without heat, without trembling. "You told people I misrepresented my condition in my letters," she said. "You know that's not true." His expression tightened. "Miss Whitmore, I told you about my leg in the second letter," she said. "The one I sent in March. You wrote back and said, it made no difference to you. I still have that letter." She did not have that letter. It was in Missouri, in a box in her brother's attic, along with all the others. But she had read it so many times she was fairly sure she could reproduce it word for word if required. "So you know what you told people is not accurate." The man beside Silas was looking between them with the expression of someone who had not been expecting this stop to be interesting. Silas's face had gone through several configurations in the last 10 seconds, and none of them were the civility it had started with. "I think you may be misremembering." "I'm not," she said. "And I think you know I'm not." A silence. She waited. She was good at waiting. "Well," he said finally. The word was hollow. "I hope things work out for you." He said it to a point, somewhere past her left shoulder, and then walked past her toward the building. Clara stood where she was for a moment. Her heart was going faster than she wanted it to. She was aware of the man, Silas had been, walking with still standing nearby, and she did not know what he had taken from what he'd just witnessed, and she could not control that. Turned back to the feed bags. The man spoke. "For what it's worth," he said quietly. That was well handled. She looked at him. He was older than she'd taken him for late 50s, maybe with a weathered face and the hands of someone who worked. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "Emmett Price," he said. "I've got a place southeast of town. Just came up to settle some accounts." He glanced in the direction Silas had gone. "I knew Mercer before he came to Dunmore. He has a habit of that." "Of what?" "Of making himself the reasonable party," Price said. "After the fact." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and walked away, and she finished loading the feed, and she drove back to the ranch in the afternoon heat, thinking about what it meant that a stranger had just given her more honest information than anyone in Dunmore had offered her since she arrived. She told Caleb about the encounter that evening. She told it straightforwardly, the way she'd been trying to do things, without the editing that came from not wanting to cause trouble, without the softening that she'd spent years applying to difficult information before delivering it to people who might react in ways she'd then have to manage. She was tired of managing other people's reactions. She told him what Silas had said, what she had said, what Price had told her afterward. Caleb listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Told him you had the letter," he said. "Yes. Do you?" "It's in Missouri," she said. "But I remember it, and he knows I remember it." Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at his hands on the table. the particular focused look he got when he was managing something internal. I should have been there, he said. You couldn't have known. No, he said. But he stopped, started again. I want you to know that what he's saying is, it doesn't change anything. Here, what I think of you.
What this?
He gestured at the space between them, at the house and the ledger and the work they'd been doing. This imprecise gesture that was meant to stand in for something he did not quite have words for yet. None of it changes any of it. Clara looked at him. She believed him. That was not something she had been certain she'd be able to say about anyone when she stepped off the train in Dunmore. But she believed Caleb Rourke the way she believed the ledger numbers and the soil temperature, fence temper, and the position of the fence posts, because she had evidence accumulated over weeks that this man said what he meant and meant what he said, imperfectly and sometimes gruffly, and occasionally not until the fourth or fifth attempt at phrasing it, but sincerely. I know, she said. He looked up at her. Then why do you look like you're still thinking about leaving? She was startled enough that she didn't immediately answer, and the lack of answer was its own kind of answer. I'm not thinking about leaving, she said. Clara, I'm thinking about what it costs, she said, to stay, for you. If I'm here and if the talk keeps building, it costs you something in this town, in how people see you, how they deal with you. And you've got enough you're managing already. He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize over the past weeks as the one he wore when he thought she was wrong about something, but was taking the time to understand why she thought it before saying so. Do you know why I have that expression? He asked. She blinked. What expression? The one you make when you've decided something is your fault that isn't your fault, he said. Get very still and a little formal. She stared at him. I wasn't aware I made an expression. You do, he said. You've been making it for 3 days. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She thought about the sleepless nights and Silas on the loading dock and the woman on the road and the sound of 2 people going quiet when she walked into the dry goods store. I have worked very hard, she said slowly, carefully, choosing each word the way you chose footing on uncertain ground, to not be someone that other people have to accommodate, to not be a problem that needs solving. My whole life that has been the thing I worked at, being capable enough that my presence cost people less than my absence would. Stopped. She had not intended to say that much. The room was very quiet. That's not what you are here, Caleb said. His voice was low and very even, the voice he used when he was certain about something. You know that. Rationally, she said. But knowing something rationally, and she stopped again. There was a word that wanted to come, and she was not ready for it. Takes longer to know it the other way, she said instead. It's all. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you argue with it. When do I argue? Constantly, he said, without rancor. Listen, I have been since Ruth died. I have been managing this place like a man trying to keep water in a cracked bucket, doing what I had to do to keep it from going under completely, and not much more than that. The injury was just the visible version of something that had already been happening for a while. He paused. You know this. You saw it in the ledger. Yes, she said. What I want to say is that I am not doing you a favor by letting you stay here. That's not what this is. You are what you have done here, what you're doing. It is the reason this place is going to make it. And I want to be clear that I know that. I don't want you to be under any impression that you are here because you have nowhere else to go. She looked at him for a long time. You're here, he said, because you are exactly what this place needed. And he stopped. His jaw tightened once and then released. What I needed, he said, even when I didn't know I needed anything. The lamp burned between them. Outside the desert was doing its quiet night work. Clara sat with what he had said and felt it land, not comfortably, because she was not a person who received this kind of thing comfortably, but it landed, found the place it was meant for, and settled there. Don't leave, he said, not because of them. She was quiet for a long time. Packed my trunk, she said. He went very still. This afternoon, she said. I packed it. I had it by the door of my room. She exhaled. I was thinking about it very seriously. And, and then I went and unpacked it, she said, because the garden still needs water. In the morning, and the ledger doesn't balance itself, and Fletcher is going to be insufferable if I'm not there to manage him. Something moved across his face. Not the almost smile this time. Closer than that. That's the reason you stayed? He asked. Sure. Fletcher is a significant responsibility, she said. The sound he made was not quite a laugh. It was something more honest than a laugh. Something that had been held back longer than laughing usually got held back. And it broke the particular tension that had been sitting in the room. Since she started talking, and she felt something in her own chest loosen in response. Go to bed, he said. We've got the eastern pasture tomorrow. I know, she said. I made a list. Of course you did. She got up from the table. She was almost to the doorway when he spoke again. Clara, she turned. I'm glad you unpacked the trunk. She looked at him for a moment. The lamp made the room amber and warm. He looked tired and certain, and more honest than most people managed on their best days. So am I, she said. She went to bed. She slept the whole night through, for the first time in 2 weeks, and in the morning the garden needed water, and the ledger didn't balance itself, and Fletcher was, as predicted, insufferable, and the day came up hot and real and hers, and she worked it straight through, from the first gray of dawn to the last gray of dawn, to the law's cold of evening, without once thinking about a man driving away from a train platform, without looking back. The banknote came due on a Tuesday. Caleb had ridden into Dunmore the day before to settle it, and Clara had stayed at the ranch because someone needed to, and because the waiting was easier when your hands were doing something. She spent the morning on the garden, and the afternoon at Nern, in the eastern, and the early evening sitting at the desk with the ledger open in front of her, running the numbers one more time. The way you checked a door lock, you had already checked. Not because you doubted it, but because the checking itself was a form of breathing. The numbers held. Barely, but they held. When Caleb came back, he came back quieter than usual, which was saying something. He unsaddled the horse without speaking, came into the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the stove too long, and was well past drinkable, and sat down. She waited. It's done, he said. The note? Paid, he looked at the cup. Hargrove at the bank asked where the funds came from. I told him cattle sales and better management of the eastern pasture. Accurate, she said. He asked if I'd taken on a partner. Clara looked up from the ledger. What did you say? Caleb was quiet for a moment. I said yes, he said, that I had. She looked at him across the table. He was looking at his coffee, not at her, with that expression he got when he had done something he considered necessary, but was uncertain how it would land. All right, she said. He looked up. All right? You paid the note, she said. That's what mattered today. Something in him settled, slightly. Hargrove knows your name, he said. He'll tell people. People already know my name, she said. They've been practicing it for weeks. He almost smiled. Fair point. She closed the ledger and set it aside and thought about the word partner, the way he'd used it with the bank man, the way it had sounded when he said it just now. It was a practical word, a working word. It did not ask anything more of the situation than the situation had already established. She appreciated that about it. She did not examine it beyond that evening. May became June without ceremony. The garden was producing in earnest. Now, tomatoes first, the way Caleb had said they would, green still but thickening on the vine, with the particular stubbornness of things that had been given what they needed and were determined to be worth it. Cattle herd was healthier than it had been. In 18 months, according to Caleb's assessment, which she had learned to trust because he was not a man given to optimistic assessments for their own. Fletcher had, if not mellowed, at least developed a working relationship with Clara based on mutual acknowledgement of limitations. She had been at the ranch for nearly 3 months. She had stopped counting the days somewhere around the second month, which she noted without making too much of it. Counting the days had been something she did in the early weeks, a habit from a life of provisional arrangements, counting how long until the next decision had to be made, until the situation clarified itself one way or another. Somewhere in the fence building and the ledger making and the cattle tending, she had stopped doing that. The days were just days now, full of work and the particular texture of this specific place, this specific land, this specific person she was sharing it with. That shift in her awareness from provisional to present was something she did not discuss with anyone. She filed it quietly and went on working. The complications of Dunmore did not disappear, but they changed in character. The talk about her had not stopped, but it had begun to compete with other things. A dispute over water rights between two ranchers north of town, the arrival of a new family from Texas, ordinary accumulation of events that gave people material closer to hand. She was not unforgotten, but she was less immediately interesting than she had been, which suited her. What did not suit her was Silas Mercer. He had developed, in the weeks since the loading dock encounter, a particular public approach to her that was worse than the outright hostility would have been. He was courteous to her in public pointedly, demonstrably courteous, in the manner of a man who wanted observers to see his magnanimity toward a woman he had wronged. Tipped his hat. He said good morning. Once at the dry goods store, he held the door for her with a graciousness so elaborate it was its own kind of insult, and she had walked through it without acknowledgement, because anything else would have given him a reaction to build on. But she understood now that he was not going to stop. The loading dock confrontation, instead of settling things, had seemed to irritate something in him, some wound to his self-image that he had not anticipated, because he had not anticipated her holding her ground. Men like Silas were accustomed to women who went quiet when pressed, who retreated into apology and accommodation, and her flat refusal to do that had left something unresolved in him that he could not seem to leave alone. Caleb saw it. He didn't say much about it, but she could tell. There was a particular quality to his attention when Silas was in proximity, a stillness that was not his usual stillness, watchful, contained. She had seen that quality once before, in the early weeks when the fever was still in him, and he was too weak to act on anything but aware of everything. It was the stillness of a person who had made a decision, but was waiting for the right moment to act on it. She didn't ask him what the decision was. She was not sure she wanted to know. The Dunmore summer gathering was not something Clara had known about when she arrived, but by June she had heard about it from enough sources to understand what it was, the annual occasion when the town and surrounding ranching community came together in the open field behind the grain warehouse for an evening of general assembly food brought from every household. Tables set out. Practical business of community life conducted alongside the social. Disputes aired. Deals discussed. Neighbors who hadn't seen each other since winter trading information and stock assessments and the accumulated news of months. It was not optional, in the way that things in small communities were not quite optional. Not attending sent a message, and the messages sent by not attending were always worse than the messages you might accidentally send by going. Caleb told her about it on a Wednesday, 2 weeks before the date, with the careful manner he used when he was delivering information he suspected she would have feelings about. "It's the last Saturday of June," he said. "I've gone every year." "Then you should go," she said. "I'd like you to come with me." She looked at him across the kitchen table. He was looking back at her with his steady dark eyes, not asking her to read anything into it, just making a direct statement and waiting for a direct response. "They'll talk," she said. "They're already talking," he said. "Going lets you be a person they've seen, rather than a story they've invented." She thought about this. It was a practical argument. She respected practical arguments. "And if Mercer's there?" she asked. "He'll be there," Caleb said. "He goes every year, too." Quiet. "You don't have to," he said. It's not a requirement, but I think it would be better for you. For your standing here, if you intend to stay. If you intend to stay." The phrase landed with a small weight. She had not formally declared any such intention, and neither had he. Their arrangement had been extended in practice without ever being discussed in terms. A working partnership that had grown its own continuity through the simple persistence of both of them, showing up every day and doing what needed doing. I'll go, she said. He nodded once. We'll take the wagon. Yes, she said, and I'm bringing the tomato preserves I put up last week, because that's the kind of thing you bring. It is, he said. Good, then it's settled. 2 weeks before the gathering were the most productive they'd had. Not because of the gathering, exactly, but because the ordinary business of the ranch had reached a kind of rhythm that allowed for real progress rather than constant correction. The second cattle sale happened on a Friday, negotiated this time by Clara directly with a buyer named Weston, who had come from Tucson specifically for stock and did not share Duval's disinclination to deal with women. Caleb had offered to handle it. You stay, she said. The equipment barn roof needs looking at before it gets any hotter. I can manage Weston. He had looked at her for a moment. You've met Weston before? No, she said, but I've read his correspondence. He's straightforward. He wants good cattle at fair prices, and he doesn't want his time wasted. She picked up the ledger page she'd prepared with the numbers. Neither do I. Caleb looked at the page and then at her. Take Fletcher, he said. Weston's coming to the south pasture. It's a harder ride. Fletcher will make me look unreliable. Fletcher will make you look like someone who doesn't need to impress anyone, Caleb said, which is different. She had taken Fletcher. The negotiation with Weston had gone well better than well. Actually, a price per head that was 15% above what she had estimated, because Weston had inspected the cattle and found them in better condition than he'd been told to expect, and he was an honest man who adjusted his offer accordingly. She rode back to the ranch in the afternoon heat, with the agreement written out and the number in her head, and she was aware of feeling something she rarely let herself feel without immediately deflating it. Pleased. She was genuinely pleased with herself. She told Caleb the number when she got back. He looked at it and looked at her and said, That's 15% better than I'd have gotten. And she said, I know. And he laughed. Not the almost law, an actual laugh. Short and real. And she felt that pleased feeling again. And this time she did not deflate it. The night before the gathering, she did not sleep well. She had been prepared for this, had known she would not sleep well, and had deliberately gone to bed early enough that even a restless night would leave her with enough rest to function. She lay in her room, listening to the ranch, doing its night things, the horses shifting, the distant cattle, Fletcher occasionally making the sound he made when he felt that the night was not conducting itself properly. And she thought about walking into a crowded field full of people who had spent 3 months building an opinion of her. And she thought about Silas Mercer and his deliberate public courtesy and what it would look like when he deployed it in front of the entire assembled community. She thought about the trunk she had packed and then unpacked. She thought about the letter she no longer had, the one that said, "It makes no difference to me." And she thought about what it meant that a man could write those words, and then 6 weeks later drive away from a platform without looking back, and then tell people she had misled him. She had been telling herself for 3 months that she did not need Dunmore's good opinion. She needed only the ranch and the work and the plan and the steady evidence of what she was actually capable of. That had been true, and it remained true, and she was not going back on it. But she was also not a person without feelings. And the feelings she had about walking into that gathering were complicated, and she was not going to pretend otherwise at 4 in the morning, alone in her room, when no one was watching. She was nervous. She was angry. She was determined in the specific way that she got determined when the thing she was walking toward had the potential to hurt her, and she was going to walk toward it anyway, because the alternative was letting it define her by her avoidance of it. She got up before dawn, made the coffee, started the morning. Caleb came out 20 minutes later and looked at her with the expression he'd developed for mornings when he could tell she hadn't slept, which was the expression of a man who saw something but was deciding whether the seeing was helpful or not. Coffee's strong, she said, before he could decide. Good, he said. He poured a cup and stood in the doorway with it and looked at the land, coming up gray and then gold with the morning. And she worked at the stove and felt the familiar comfort of the kitchen sounds. The smell of the coffee, ordinary start of an ordinary morning that was not, in fact, Ordinary. We leave at 4 this afternoon, he said. That gets us there before the peak of the crowd. Good, she said. You'll do fine, I know, she said. He looked at her over his coffee cup. You don't sound like you know. I know it factually, she said. The rest of me is working on it. He nodded. He understood the distinction. She had come to realize, the person who understood the difference between knowing a thing and having the knowing settle all the way down into the part of you that actually governed your behavior. And he did not dismiss the gap between those two things, which most people did. For what it's worth, he said, you walk into that field and you're the person who pulled this ranch back from the edge. That's a fact these people can see whether they want to or not. The ledger doesn't lie. The cattle don't lie. The fence and the garden and the... He stopped, made a gesture that encompassed the kitchen. All of it. It's real. Their talk isn't. She looked at him. Thank you, she said. He nodded and went back to his coffee. She went back to the stove and let the words sit in her chest where they belonged. The gathering was everything she had imagined it would be, and a few things she hadn't. Field behind the grain warehouse was full by the time they arrived. 50, 60 people at least. Wagons drawn up at the edges, tables laid with food, children running in the ways. Children ran when they had been told to behave and immediately forgot. The air smelled of wood smoke and something roasting, and the particular dust of a summer evening in the Arizona territory. She carried the tomato preserves. Caleb walked beside her, and she was aware of the precise social fact of that, of them arriving together, their wagon together, walking together across the field. She was aware of the small shifts in conversation around them as they moved, the eyes that tracked, and then were politely redirected. She nodded to people she recognized. Some nodded back. Some found their attention required elsewhere. Emmett Price was there, near the far table, and he caught her eye and lifted his chin in a brief acknowledgement that she returned. She found herself unreasonably glad to see a face that was not hostile. Harwick was there, and he came over immediately with the manner of a man who had decided his position on a thing and was comfortable with it. He shook Caleb's hand and looked at Clara with a directness she appreciated. Miss Whitmore, he said, I heard about the Weston deal. 15% above asking. Fair price for fair cattle, she said. What Weston said. Harwick nodded in a way that meant something. Good to see you here. He moved on, and Clara registered the small increment of that, not a victory, nothing as dramatic as a victory, just a data point. One person. Genuine. It was something. She set the tomato preserves on the food table next to a woman she didn't know who was arranging a pie, and the woman looked at the preserves and said, Those from the Rourke place? And Clara said yes, and the woman said heard. You've been putting in a garden, and Clara said I have, and the woman said nothing further, but also did not move away, which, in Dunmore, Clara had learned, was its own form of not unfriendly. She was standing near the edge of the tables, watching Caleb talk to a rancher she recognized as one of the Eastern operators, when she felt it. The shift in the crowd's texture that meant someone had entered who changed things. Silas Mercer came across the field with 3 men she half recognized, moving with the ease of a person who was comfortable in this space, who had always been comfortable in this space. He had a way of being in a room afield, anywhere, that communicated belonging, that said without words, I am a figure here. I have been a figure here. She had seen it the first time she laid eyes on him on the platform, and she had noted it then as a quality, not yet knowing what quality it would turn out to be. He saw her. She saw him see her. For a moment, nothing happened. The field went on around them. The conversations, the children, the wood smoke. And Silas Mercer stood 20 feet away and looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, and she looked back at him with an expression she was carefully not making. Then he came toward her. She waited. He stopped at a distance that was social, public, correct. He had 2 of his men with him, which meant he wanted witnesses, which meant he had something he wanted witnessed. Whitmore, he said. Glad to see you. Made it to the gathering. Silas, she said. How are things at the Rourke place? I hear there's been some improvement. The word improvement was inflected in a way that made it mean something adjacent to, but not quite the same as what the word actually meant. The ranch is doing well, she said. Thank you for asking. Good, good. He glanced around the field with the look of a man making sure his audience was properly assembled. Good when things work out, for everyone involved. He paused. Caleb is lucky to have help. The word help landed the way it was designed to land. Clara looked at him. She kept her voice even and her face still, and she said nothing for 3 seconds, which was long enough for the silence to have a shape. I'm not sure luck is the right word, she said. It's been a lot of work. Of course, of course. He smiled, and the smile was the performance she'd been watching for 3 months. That's what I meant. It takes a particular kind of woman to settle in the way you have. Settle in. Another word made to do work it wasn't supposed to do. She was about to speak. She had a sentence ready, measured, not a scene but a correction, delivered at the same social level as everything else, when she heard the footsteps behind her. Caleb. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her, not between her and Silas beside her, at the same line, shoulder level. She was aware of him, without looking at him. Mercer, Caleb said. Rourke. Silas's smile adjusted. Was just telling Miss Whitmore it's good to see her settled. She's not settled, Caleb said. She's working. There's a difference. Silas tilted his head in the small patronizing gesture she had come to recognize. Of course, didn't mean anything by it. I know what you meant, Caleb said. Same thing you've been meaning for 3 months. Field around them had not gone quiet. The gathering was too large and too busy for that, but in their immediate vicinity, in the ring of people close enough to hear, conversations had found reasons to pause. Silas's expression shifted. The smile dropped its social costume. I don't think we need to. She told you about her leg, Caleb said. In writing. In March. You wrote back and told her it made no difference. Then you drove away from the station without getting out of your wagon. His voice was level and not loud, but it had a quality of clarity to it that carried. That's the situation. Everything else you've been telling people is built on top of that. Silas's jaw tightened. Rourke, I'm not finished, Caleb said, not raising his voice, not needing to. This woman walked to my ranch after you left her on that platform. Walked it, in the July heat. Found me dying in my own barn and spent 4 days keeping me alive with what she'd bought from Harwick's, with money she couldn't afford to spend. Then she stayed and she worked, and she turned a ledger that was headed for the bank, taking everything into something that's standing on its own. He paused. You told people she misrepresented herself. I'm telling people that's a lie, and everyone here can decide which one of us they believe. The silence in their vicinity was complete now. Silas looked around it. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara. She had not moved. She was standing exactly where she had been standing, with her back straight and her face as still as she could hold it, and she was aware of the eyes on her and the weight of the moment, and the fact that Caleb had just said, in public, in front of the assembled community of Dunmore, things that could not be unsaid. She had not asked him to. She had not expected him to. She was not certain, even now, how she felt about it. There was something in her that wanted to say she could have managed it herself, and something else, quieter, that said yes, but he chose to stand beside you, and those are different things. I said what I said, Silas said, and his voice had gone tight and flat. People can make their own judgments. They can, Caleb said. They will. Silas looked at him for one more moment. Then he looked at Clara with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not anger, not the performed civility. Something rawer than either. Something that looked like a man seeing, briefly and unwillingly, an accurate version of himself. Then he turned and walked away. His men went with him. Field reassembled itself around the space. He'd left conversations resumed. The children went back to running. The wood smoke kept its smell. It happened gradually, and then all at once the Waysea silence filled back up with life. Clara became aware that she was breathing faster than she wanted to be. She was also aware, without looking directly, of several people near them, who had not resumed their conversations as quickly as the others, who were standing with the slightly stunned quality of people who had just witnessed something recalibrate itself, and were not, yet certain what to do with the new configuration. Caleb turned to her. He was checking. She understood not for damage exactly, but for how she was. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I was about to say something." "I know that too," he said. "But I've been not saying that for 3 months. I thought it was time." She looked at him. The field moved around them in its ordinary evening way. People and children and food, and the end of a long summer day. "You said I walked to your ranch," she said. "You did. It's 4 miles. I know how far it is. You never said anything about knowing I'd walked it." He looked at her steadily. "Harwick told me. Day you arrived. He told me someone had asked for directions to my place and set off on foot." He paused. "Thought about that a lot. In those early days when I was barely keeping track of what was happening. I thought about it." She did not know what to do with that information, so she did what she often did with things she needed time for. She set it aside carefully, in a place she would be able to find it later. "Thank you," she said. "What you said." He nodded. "Accurate," she said. "Yes," he said, "it was." The rest of the evening rearranged itself. It did not become a triumph. Clara was not a person who thought in those terms, and the reality of it was more complicated than that anyway. But it changed. The quality of the interactions changed. Harwick came back and introduced her to his wife, who shook her hand with a directness Clara appreciated. The woman from the food table came and asked about the tomato variety, genuine curiosity, and they talked about soil quality and irrigation for 5 minutes in the way that people talked about things they both understood. Emmett Price came over with his hat in his hands and asked if Caleb had considered the fall market, and the three of them stood together talking livestock prices in the early evening light, like 3 ranchers, discussing the things ranchers discussed, which was what they were. The people who had been hostile did not become warm. She did not expect that. Some of them moved away when she came near and she noted it and filed it and did not let it subtract from the other things she was filing alongside it. Silas Mercer did not come back into her orbit. She saw him once at the far edge of the field, and he was talking to someone she didn't know, and he did not look in her direction. And she did not look in his for longer than the single second it took to register where he was. At some point in the evening, after the food, after the sun had dropped behind the ridge and the air had cooled to something almost comfortable, Suzmion produced a fiddle. She had not been expecting music. She had been operating on the principle of managing one thing at a time, and music had not been on the list. The fiddle player was a young man she'd seen at Harwick's, and he was genuinely good. Not a scratchy approximation of music she'd heard at rural gatherings in Missouri, but actual music. Kind that found the old patterns in the air and pulled them into something that moved. Caleb appeared at her elbow. "I should warn you," he said, "that I'm not good at this." She looked at him. "At what?" He tilted his head very slightly toward the small open area where a few couples had begun to move. She looked at the dancing. She looked at him. "I'm not either," she said. "Well," he said, "then we'll be equally bad at it." She looked at the dancing again. She thought about the last time she had danced, which was so long ago she couldn't clearly place it, some occasion in Missouri. Before everything. Before her mother died and her brother married, and the shape of her life narrowed down to what it had been, before she wrote the first letter. Thought about the platform, the wagon, the heat. She thought about the barn and the fever and the 4 miles she had walked because she'd heard a rumor about a man who might be dying, and she'd been out of other options. And she thought about 3 months of work, and the ledger and the cattle and the fence and the garden, and the trunk she had packed and unpacked in the same afternoon. "All right," she said. They were in fact equally bad at it. She could not move the way she might have wanted. To her left side had its limits, and dancing pressed them, and he was stiff from months of injury and from the general awkwardness of a man who had not danced in years and knew it. They moved in the approximate direction of the music with a shared imprecision that would not have impressed anyone watching, and she was aware of people watching. and she did not care, and that not caring was one of the realest feelings she'd had in 3 months. At some point she laughed. She was not sure exactly when something about the way he almost stepped on her foot and then overcorrected in the wrong direction, and the face he made when he did it. But she laughed. A short, genuine thing that surprised her as much as him. He looked at her with the closest thing to open expression she had seen on him. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. They kept moving, approximately, in the approximate direction of the music, in the warm summer dark of a field in Arizona, and the fiddle played on, and the town of Dunmore went about its ordinary evening around them. And the man who had driven away from a platform 3 months ago was somewhere at the far edge of the field and was becoming incrementally, and then completely irrelevant to everything that mattered. They rode home in the dark. The wagon moved through the desert quiet, the horse knowing the road, the stars above the territory doing what desert stars did, filling in every available space, more stars than sky. Kind of sky that made Missouri feel like a different world, and not just a different place. She was tired in the way she got tired after significant things, a bone-deep exhaustion that was not unpleasant, the tiredness of a day that had used all of her. Caleb drove without talking. She sat beside him and watched the road come up pale in the starlight, and felt the sway of the wagon, and did not feel the need to fill the quiet. After a while he said, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He considered it. "I am," he said, as if the conclusion had surprised him mildly. She nodded. They went on. "Price wants to discuss a joint arrangement," Caleb said, after another while. "Spring cattle drive. His operation and ours combined would be large enough to negotiate at the Tucson market, rather than selling locally. That would improve the price significantly," she said. "Yes." "We should look at the numbers," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked up at the stars. "In the morning," she said. "In the morning," he agreed. The ranch came into view eventually, the dark shape of it against the darker shape of the land, the small light she had left burning in the kitchen window visible from half a mile away, warm and specific in hers, in the particular way that a thing became yours when you had worked for it, with your hands and your mind, and your refusal to leave when leaving would have been easier. She had left a light on. She had been doing that, she realized, without thinking about it, leaving the kitchen light burning when she rode out in the evening, so there was something lit to come back to. It was a small habit, a domestic one, the kind of thing a person did when they had stopped thinking of a place as temporary. She looked at the light in the window and thought, "I live here, not provisionally, not while figuring out the next step, just here. This place, this work, this difficult and imperfect and very real life." The wagon pulled into the yard. Fletcher made his sound of greeting, which was the same sound he made for everything, and was therefore not particularly informative, but she had grown fond of it anyway. Caleb set the brake, and she climbed down before he could offer a hand. Not from pride exactly, just from practice, from the long habit of managing her own exits and her own entrances, and she landed on the packed earth of the yard and looked up at the stars and felt the day settle around her. "Clara," Caleb said. She turned. He was still on the wagon seat, and he was looking at her with something in his expression that she had been seeing more of lately. Something she had been carefully not naming, because naming it would require her to decide what to do about it, and she had not been ready. "What you said tonight was right," he said. "What I said was right, and I want you to know, it wasn't just for the town. It wasn't for their benefit." She looked at him. "I said it because it was true," he said, "and because you've been here 3 months, and I haven't said enough of the true things. That's on me." The desert was quiet around them. The kitchen light burned in the window. "You've said the important ones," she said. "Not all of them," he said. She looked at him for a long time, standing in the yard of a ranch she had come to by accident, in a life she had not planned, with a man she had not expected, who was looking at her like she was something he had found when he was not looking for anything at all. "There's time," she said. He nodded slowly. "There is," he said, "if you want there to be." She turned toward the house and the light in the window, and the morning that would come with its work and its complications and its ordinary, difficult real days. And she said, over her shoulder, in the dark, with the stars above the Arizona territory, doing their patient work, I want there to be. She went inside. She did not look back, but she was smiling, in the kitchen light, with her back against the door and the night outside, and the ranch, around her smiling in the way that happened, when something landed exactly where it was supposed to land, without fanfare, without perfection, just right. She said it over her shoulder in the dark, and then she went inside, and she did not examine it further that night, because she was tired, and the kitchen was warm, and there was still the morning to prepare for. But she thought about it when she was lying in her room later, in the narrow bed, with the springs that made their sound, staring at the ceiling in the way she did when her mind would not fully release the day. I want there to be. 4 words. She had said them without planning them, the way the truest things sometimes came, not as decisions but as discoveries, things you didn't know you knew until you heard yourself saying them out loud. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had established that about herself through considerable evidence over 31 years. But this particular thing, the slow certain weight of what was developing between her and Caleb Rourke, frightened her in the specific way that only good things frightened her, because good things had a way of being taken back. She had learned that early, and she had never fully unlearned it. She let herself feel the fear for exactly as long as it took to name it clearly. Then she turned over in the narrow bed and went to sleep. The morning came with its work, and the work was what it always was, real, demanding, indifferent to the interior weather of the people doing it. The cattle needed tending. Fletcher needed managing. The garden needed its daily check, because the tomatoes were at the stage where a single overlooked day of too little water could set the whole plant back a week. Caleb was at the stove when she came into the kitchen, which was not his usual position. He had made the coffee and was making something else, eggs, from the sound of it, with more confidence than she would have predicted from a man who had been eating her cooking for 3 months, and apparently not attempting his own. Stopped in the doorway. He did not look up. Sit down, he said. I can cook eggs. I didn't say anything. You had a face. I was expressionless. You had an expressionless face, he said, which is a face you make, specifically when you're thinking something you've decided not to say. She sat down at the table. He brought the eggs over. They were overcooked on one edge and slightly underdone in the center, which was a combination she would not have thought geometrically possible. She ate them without comment. He sat across from her and ate his, and the kitchen was warm, and the morning light came through the east window, the way it always did at this hour. That particular Arizona light, flat and honest, that showed everything exactly as it was. And they sat together in the ordinary companionable silence that had become, over 3 months, one of the things she valued most about this life. Price sent word, he said. He wants to meet Thursday, about the spring arrangement. I'll be ready, she said. He's bringing his ledger. Good, bring ours. He nodded. He looked at his coffee. He said, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been thinking about how to say something since the previous evening, about last night. She waited. I meant what I said, he said. I know, she said, and what you said. I know that too, she said. He looked at her across the table, and she looked back at him, and neither of them performed anything. No coyness, no deflection, none of the social dressing that people put on around things that mattered. They were both too old for it, and too tired of it, and too thoroughly acquainted with each other's plain speech by now for anything else to feel right. I don't want to make assumptions, he said, about what you meant, or what you want. I don't make statements. I don't mean, she said. I know that. Then you're not making assumptions, she said. You're accurately reading what I said. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. All right, she said. They finished their breakfast. The eggs were not good, but she ate them all, and she did not say anything about it, and he did not ask. And outside Fletcher was making his morning sounds, and the horses were at the trough, and the garden was waiting for its water, and the day opened up in front of them, ordinary and full. July arrived with heat that made June feel like an apology. The work continued. It always continued. That was the truth of ranch life that no one who had not lived it fully understood until they were in it. The work did not pause for personal developments or emotional clarifications or the slow reorganization of a life. It asked for the same things on a Tuesday after a significant Saturday as it had asked on every Tuesday before. The cattle, the fence, the water, the accounts, the 100 small decisions that kept a living operation alive. Clara gave it what it asked for. What changed was less visible and more real than any of the external things. It was the way she moved through the ranch now, not as someone proving herself worthy of being there, not as someone waiting to see if the arrangement held, but as someone who was simply there in the way that you were in a place that was yours. The difference between provisional and permanent was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was just the way you set something down with the ease of someone who expected to pick it up again tomorrow instead of the careful placement of someone who wasn't sure. She set things down with ease now. She noticed Caleb noticing this. He did not comment on it. He was not, as she had established thoroughly, over 4 months, a man who commented on things that were working, commented on things that needed fixing. When things were right, he let them be right, which was a quality she had come to appreciate the way you appreciated functional plumbing, without drama, with deep, genuine gratitude. The Thursday meeting with Price happened in the ranch kitchen around the same table where she and Caleb had built their first plan 4 months ago. Emmett Price was a different kind of man than Caleb Louder, more immediately sociable, with a habit of slapping his knee when he found something satisfactory. But he was also fundamentally honest. And when he opened his ledger on the table next to hers, she could see that he was a man who understood numbers and did not inflate them for effect. They spent 3 hours on it. Price had not been certain going in how to address her. She could see him calibrating, not dismissing her but uncertain of the protocol, of how much weight to give her contributions relative to Caleb's. She recognized this and did not take offense at it. It was the ordinary confusion of a person encountering a situation for which their experience had not prepared them, and the solution was always the same. Demonstrate competence until the confusion became irrelevant. She demonstrated competence. By the end of the second hour, Price was directing his questions equally to both of them, and by the third hour, he was directing the specific financial questions primarily to her, because she had shown him that she had the numbers more precisely organized than Caleb did, and Price was too practical a man to address financial questions to the less precise person just because of what was expected. When they shook hands on the arrangement, a joint spring drive, Tucson market, profit split proportional to headcount. Price shook hers as firmly as Caleb's. "You've got a good partner, Rourke," he said to Caleb, but looking at her. "I know it," Caleb said. She said nothing, but she felt it land, the word, from this man, in this context, meaning exactly what it said, and nothing more complicated than that, and she let it. August brought a new problem, because the ranch had reached a point where it was stable enough to have new problems instead of the same old crisis repeating. The problem was water. More specifically, it was the water running from the eastern ridge down through the canyon that fed the creek that served the back pasture, and the fact that someone upstream had been diverting it. She discovered it on a Tuesday morning when she rode out to check the cattle and found the creek running at less than half its usual depth. She checked the channel carefully, the way Caleb had taught her to read water flow, looking for the signs of interference upstream rather than natural reduction, and found them within 2 miles of the ranch boundary. Someone had built a small earthen diversion dam in the canyon above, recent construction, probably within the last 2 weeks. She came back and told Caleb what she'd found, with the same plainness she used for everything. He listened, and then was very still in the specific way he got still when he was angry, and she let the stillness happen. "Aldridge," he said. "Tom Aldridge has the operation north of the canyon." Tom Aldridge. The man from the dry goods store, 4 months ago, who had told her a woman in her position ought to be careful. She had not forgotten Tom Aldridge, but she had, with great deliberateness, stopped thinking about him. The work had replaced the grievance, the way real things usually replace the smaller things when you let them. "Can we prove it's him?" she asked. "The construction is on open land," Caleb said. He'd argue natural rights to the flow. "What does the law say?" he told her. It was complicated. Water law in the territory was a patchwork of precedent and contest, and whoever argued their case most persistently tended to win more than whoever argued most accurately. He had seen it before. He had seen ranches broken by it. She sat with this for a moment. "Price," she said. "Does he draw from the same watershed?" Caleb looked at her. "Yes," he said slowly. "He does. Then he has the same problem," she said. "Or he will, once Aldridge realizes it. And Price has more resources to pursue a legal remedy than we do alone." He looked at her for another moment. "You're thinking we go to him." "I'm thinking a coalition is harder to dismiss than a single complaint," she said. "Aldridge can argue with one rancher. He'd have a harder time arguing with three, with documented water flow records and a legal filing." "Do we have documented water flow records?" Caleb asked. "We will," she said. "Give me 2 weeks." She spent those 2 weeks measuring and recording, riding out to the creek every morning, noting the depth and flow rate, building the paper record that turned an observed problem into an arguable fact. She rode to Price's place on the 8th day and explained the situation, and he listened with the knee-slapping attention. He gave to things he found immediately satisfactory, in this case meaning, a problem that had a solution he could act on. "I've been watching that creek too," he said. "Thought it was the dry spell." "Some of it is," she said. "Not all of it." He looked at her measurements. He looked at his own. "We get Duval too," he said. "He's on the same water." "I hadn't thought of Duval," she said. "He doesn't like Aldridge," Price said. "Personal history. He'll join." 4 ranchers filing a joint water complaint against Tom Aldridge's diversion was, it turned out, a thing that the Territorial Water Authority took seriously in a way they might not have taken one. Process was slow and bureaucratic, and she filled out more forms than she had filled out in her entire previous life. But it moved, and in the 3rd week of September, Aldridge was ordered to remove the diversion dam and restore the natural flow. She heard about it on a Friday from Price, who rode over specifically to tell them. "He's not happy," Price said, with the tone of a man who found this outcome entirely acceptable. "He doesn't have to be happy," Clara said. "He has to comply." Price laughed, the knee-slapping variety, and Caleb allowed himself the small, satisfied expression. He allowed himself when things resolved correctly, and Clara wrote the outcome in the margin of her water flow records and filed them in the desk drawer because documentation, she had learned, was the thing that kept settled matters settled. September cooled things, fractionally, the way September cooled the Arizona Territory. Not enough to call it cool, but enough to make the afternoons breathable again. Enough that the evening air had something in it that felt like relief. The garden had done what she'd hoped it would do. The tomatoes had been the success Caleb had predicted, and she had put up 30 jars of preserves and another 20 of sauce. And the squash had done what squash always did, which was produce beyond any reasonable expectation and require distribution to every person within visiting distance. And the beans had been good if not spectacular, and 2 of the melon plants she'd put in, as an experiment, had given them more melons than they knew what to do with. She looked at the garden on a September evening when the air was beginning to do its cooling thing, standing at the edge of it with a cup of coffee she'd brought out from the kitchen, and she thought about the woman who had planted this ground 2 years ago, Ruth. She still did not know much about her. Caleb spoke of her rarely and carefully, with the precision of someone who had decided what he was willing to say and what he was not. Clara had not pushed. She had her own things she held carefully, and she understood the need for that. But she had planted her garden in Ruth's ground, and things had grown, and she thought that meant something. Not anything mystical, nothing she couldn't account for in plain agricultural terms, but something. About continuity. About how a place holds what was given to it and gives it forward. Caleb came out of the barn and saw her standing at the garden's edge. He came and stood beside her in the way he did, not asking anything, just present. She'd have liked the tomatoes, he said after a while. Clara looked at the last of them on the vine, the ones she was letting go to seed for next year's planting. The tomatoes were good, she said. She was particular about tomatoes, he said. Wouldn't buy them from anyone else's garden. Said she could taste the difference. She was probably right, Clara said. You can taste care. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I think you can. She sipped her coffee, and he stood beside her, and the evening came down easy over the land. And they were two imperfect people standing in a garden that had come back from nothing. And neither of them said anything more about it, because nothing more needed saying. It was a Sunday in October when he asked her, not dramatically, not with any of the staging that the question sometimes got in other people's tellings of other people's lives. It was a Sunday morning, the good cool of the autumn coming through the kitchen window she'd left open, and she was making the coffee, and he was sitting at the table with the ledger. He had started working the ledger himself, which she had noted with quiet satisfaction as a sign that the numbers no longer terrified him. And she was thinking about the spring drive and the Tucson market, and whether the eastern pasture could support the additional head they'd need to make the numbers work. Clara said, look at me for a minute. She turned from the stove. He had set the ledger aside, and he was sitting with his hands flat on the table in the particular deliberate way of a man who had decided to be very still while saying something that mattered to him. I've been trying to figure out how to say this in a way that isn't clumsy, he said. I've been trying for about 3 weeks. She leaned against the counter and waited. You know I'm not a man who says things easily, he said. I'm aware, she said. And you know that I mean what I say when I do say it. I know that too. He looked at his hands on the table. I want to ask you to marry me, he said. Not because of the ranch or the arrangement or any practical reason. Those exist, and they're real. And I'm not going to pretend they're not part of it, because we're both practical people, and that's not nothing. They're not the reason I'm asking. She looked at him. The reason I'm asking, he said, is that 4 months ago, I was in a barn dying, and you walked 4 miles in the July heat to find a man you'd never met, and you didn't leave. And every day since then, you have been. He stopped, pressed his lips together in the way he did when words were proving inadequate. You've made this place worth keeping, he said. Not just the ranch. I mean this. He touched his chest, briefly, with one hand uncharacteristically unguarded gesture. I had let most of it go. After Ruth, I didn't mean to, but I had, and you didn't ask me to explain myself or account for it, or be different than I was. You just started working. And somewhere in the working, I started again, too. Kitchen was very quiet. I know this isn't what you came to Arizona for, he said. I know Mercer was what you came for, and I know what that arrangement cost you. I'm not asking you to settle for something less than what you wanted. I'm asking you to... He stopped again. I'm asking you to tell me honestly whether what's here is something you want, on its own terms, not because it's available and you're here, but because you want it. Clara looked at him for a long time. She thought about the letter she had written in St. Louis, the careful paragraphs explaining who she was and what she could offer, and that she walked with a limp from an old injury. And she thought about the reply that said it makes no difference to me. And she thought about the platform and the wagon and the heat and the 4 miles. She thought about the barn and the fever and the carbolic salve and the long nights checking his breathing. She thought about the fence and the ledger and the cattle and the sleepless nights and the trunk she packed and unpacked. She thought about the gathering and the dance and the voice that said you judged her by the way she walks and the stars above the territory on the wagon ride home. She thought about this morning, the coffee, the open window, the ledger on the table, the ordinary Sunday in October that felt more like home than any place she had lived. Caleb, she said, what Silas Mercer offered me was a version of being chosen because I was available and willing and had adequately low expectations. That's what I came for. Not because I wanted it, but because I had been told that was the appropriate scale of ambition for a woman in my position. She paused. What you're asking is completely different. He watched her. You're asking me whether I want this, she said. Specifically this. Not whether I'll accept it or settle for it or make the best of it. Whether I want it. Yes, he said. Then I want it, she said. I want this ranch and this work and this life. She held his gaze. I want you. That is a sentence I have not said to another person in my adult life, and I am saying it not now because it is accurate, and you deserve an accurate answer. He was very still. Then he stood up from the table, which he did with more speed than he usually moved, and the distance between them was not large to begin with, and she met him halfway because she was not a person who waited for things to come to her when she could go toward them. Instead, he was not a graceful man. He was a ranching man with a healed wound and calloused hands and years of loss on him, and the way he held her was not graceful either. It was certain, and a little desperate in the way that things were desperate when they had been kept back longer than was comfortable. And she held him back with the same certainty. And neither of them said anything for a while, because nothing that needed saying required words at that particular moment. The coffee had gone past ready and was heading toward too strong. She became aware of this and did not move to address it. They were married in November, in the small office of the county registrar in Dunmore, with Emmett Price and his wife as witnesses. Clara wore her best dress, which was blue, and Caleb wore the good shirt she had mended twice, and which fit him well across the shoulders. The registrar was a fussy man named Cope who performed the proceeding, with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times and considered the paperwork the important part. She signed her name in the register Clara Rourke and looked at it for a moment before she handed the pen back. Just a name, just letters in ink on a page. She was still the same woman who had packed and unpacked a trunk, who had walked 4 miles in July heat, who had measured water flow records for 2 weeks and filed a coalition complaint that forced a man twice her social standing to remove an illegal diversion dam. The name was new. The woman was the same. Outside Price's wife, a kind, sharp-eyed woman named Dora, who had taken to Clara with a directness she appreciated, pressed her hands warmly and said, "Well done," which was an unusual thing to say at a wedding, and was exactly right. They had lunch at the hotel dining room, the 4 of them, and it was not a romantic lunch. Price spent most of it talking about the spring drive with Caleb, and Dora talked to Clara about the water rights case with genuine professional interest, because Dora, it emerged, had dealt with a similar situation on their own property years ago, and it was imperfect and ordinary and more real than anything staged could have been. On the ride home, Caleb said, "Price talked through most of our wedding lunch about cattle." "He did," Clara said. "I'm sorry about that. I was talking about water rights with Dora," she said. "I think it balanced out." He looked at her. "Most women would want a different kind of wedding day." "I'm not most women," she said. "You knew that before you asked." He looked at the road ahead. "Yes," he said, "I did." She reached over and put her hand on his arm, a simple gesture, uncomplicated, and left it there. And he drove the wagon home in the November afternoon with her hand on his arm and the territory opening out around them, in the particular way it opened at this hour, vast and honest and indifferent to small human dramas, entirely indifferent, and she found that she did not mind the indifference at all. It meant the land did not care about her limp. It did not care about Silas Mercer's wagon, or his letters, or his public courtesies. It did not care what the women in the dry goods store thought, or what Tom Aldridge had intended with his earthen dam. The land was just the land, and what you made of it was what you made of it, and that was the whole of the equation. Winter came, and with it a different pace, not rest, because nothing on a working ranch was rest, but a different distribution of the work, less urgent in some places and more demanding in others. She learned the winter routines the way she'd learned the summer ones, by doing them, by asking when she didn't know, by watching Caleb and letting his knowledge of the land supplement what she brought to it. They were not easy together all the time. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the telling of it, even now, looking back across the months at the shape of what had happened. She did not want to sand the edges off it into something it wasn't, they argued. They were two people with strong views and limited patience for being wrong, and there were mornings when the kitchen was tense in ways it hadn't been when they were merely partners. Because marriage made the stakes different, made the silences carry more weight. There was one week in January when they did not speak easily. A disagreement about the spring drive plan that became, in the way of arguments between people who knew each other well, about something other than the spring drive plan. She did not want to detail the specifics of it because the specifics were not the point. The point was that they had the argument and did not handle it perfectly, and eventually came back to each other, imperfectly, the way you came back to something real, not with grand reconciliation, but with the ordinary continuation of a shared life that had more value than the argument did. He brought her coffee one morning, silently, placed it on the desk where she was working on the accounts, and went back outside. She drank it and looked at the ledger and thought, this is what staying looks like. Not a feeling, an action repeated. She went out and helped him with the fence section that needed mending, and they worked in the cold morning without talking much. And by noon the fence was done and the argument was done too. Not resolved in the way of complete satisfaction on either side, but resolved in the way of two people who had decided that the relationship mattered more than being right. That was the real thing. The thing she had not known to look for when she was writing letters in St. Louis, when she was building a man out of careful words on paper and allowing herself to hope. She had been looking for someone who would choose her. She had been so fixed on the choosing, on being found acceptable, on meeting the standard, that she had not thought clearly about what she actually needed, which was something more specific and more difficult than being chosen. She needed someone who would stay, who would do the work of staying, the unglamorous daily work of it, not because it was easy, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Someone who would bring her coffee after a hard week and mean it as an apology and know that she would understand it as one, and someone who could be wrong and come back from being wrong without making the coming back into a production. Caleb Rourke was that person. He was also occasionally infuriating and difficult and more closed off than was sometimes comfortable and bad at making eggs, and had a relationship with Fletcher that she suspected was more affectionate than he would ever admit. He was imperfect in the specific ways that his particular life had made him imperfect, and she was imperfect in hers, and what they had built between them was imperfect too, and entirely real. She had stopped needing it to be more than real. That was the thing. The shift she had not been able to anticipate from the St. Louis end of it. She had thought that what she needed was to find the right place, the right arrangement, the right man who would see past the obvious things and recognize her worth. And some of that had been true. But what she had not understood was that the finding was not a single event. It was not a moment, not the 4 miles in July heat, not the barn, not the gathering, not the October morning in the kitchen. Those were parts of it, points on a line, but the line itself was the thing. The choosing was continuous. Every day she woke in this house, in this life, with this man, and she chose it again. That was not a romantic notion. It was a practical one, and she was a practical woman. And the practicality of it was what made it solid, what gave it the weight that things needed to last. Spring came back around as it did. The drive to Tucson happened in April 4 ranchers, their combined herds, a week on the road that was dusty and exhausting, and not remotely romantic, and the market price was better than any of them had gotten locally in years. And she rode home with Caleb, with the numbers in her head, and the satisfaction of a plan fully executed sitting in her chest like a banked coal. On the evening they came back, she stood at the edge of the garden in the last light, the new plantings just beginning to show, in the turned earth, the tomato seedlings she'd started inside, waiting in the kitchen window for another few weeks before they were ready for the ground. And she looked at the ranch, at the whole of it, the way you looked at something you had a stake in. The house with its kitchen light, the barn where she had found a dying man and made a decision, the paddock with the horses and Fletcher, who came to the fence and regarded her with his usual assessment-rich expression. Back pasture, green with the winter rains, the fence they had built running straight and solid along the ridge. Creek running at proper depth, restored by the order Aldridge had not wanted to comply with and had complied with anyway because the law had been on their side and they had documented it. She thought about the woman who had stood on a platform in Dunmore with a small trunk and a few dollars, and the specific vertigo of having arrived somewhere, only to find the somewhere had disappeared. She remembered what that felt like, not as a wound, not anymore, but as a fact, the way a scar was a fact. Something had happened. She had not been broken by it. She had walked 4 miles and found something she had not been looking for and built a life in it with her own hands. That was not a story about being rescued. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the private telling of it. Caleb had not rescued her. She had, in the most literal sense, been the one doing the rescuing. That first week in the barn, and what had happened since was not rescue in any sense she recognized. It was partnership, which was a different thing entirely. Partnership meant both people carrying the weight, both people making the decisions, both people wrong sometimes and right sometimes, and neither one of them waiting to be saved. The people who looked at her limp and thought they understood her situation had always been wrong from the beginning. They had seen a limitation and concluded a diminishment. They had not understood that limitation and diminishment were not the same thing, that a person could be limited in one specific way and unlimited in all the ways that actually mattered to the life they were building. She understood this now with a certainty that had no bitterness in it. The bitterness had been there once. Was honest enough to admit that, in the early weeks, in the sleepless nights, in the sound of Silas Mercer's wagon disappearing down the road. But bitterness was corrosive in the way that rust was corrosive, and she had not wanted to spend her energy maintaining it. Spent her energy on the fence and the cattle and the ledger and the water rights and the spring drive, and the result of that spending was standing around her in the April evening like something accumulated. Caleb came out of the barn and stood beside her at the garden's edge. He looked at what she was looking at. "The tomato seedlings need another 3 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. "The eastern pasture is ready for the additional head. I know that too." She looked at him. He was looking at the land with the expression she had come to love. She used the word plainly and without ceremony because it was the accurate word. The expression of a man who had very nearly lost this and knew it and did not take a day of it for granted. "You're thinking something," he said, without looking at her. "I'm thinking that the ledger is in better shape than it's ever been," she said. "And the cattle are healthy, and the garden is planted, and we have a good spring drive behind us. And," she looked out at the ranch, at all of it. "And I'm thinking that a woman who is waiting to be chosen," she said, "never gets to find out what she would have chosen for herself." She paused. "I'm glad I found that out." He turned to look at her. The April light was the long gold kind, the kind that was generous to everything it touched, and he looked at her in it with the open expression she had learned to read over the months. Not happiness exactly, something older and less simple than happiness. Contentment, maybe. The feeling of a person who had arrived at something true. So am I," he said. She nodded once. She turned back to the garden and thought about what she would plant in the empty row on the south side, the one she'd been deciding about all winter. She thought she would try peppers. She had never grown peppers before. She did not know yet whether the soil would suit them. She would find out. She always found out. The evening settled over the Arizona territory in the quiet, patient way of evenings that have no particular agenda, and the ranch held its light a little longer than the land around it. And Clara Rourke stood in her garden on the edge of her life, imperfect and real and entirely her own, and thought about tomorrow.